He arrives in the lobby of this building, 74 Trinity Place, which is a block and a half south of the World Trade Center. And I met him in the lobby, and I brought him up here because he was going into the video shoot with us on the 4th floor at 9 o'clock. He was going to go into makeup, and I wanted him to have some rest and quiet before he went into makeup. So I put him in my study, and then I went back to my office, and moments later the first plane went in. And it sounded like it went right over the top of my head. We're on the 21st floor here, and this building is 25 stories high. And I thought the darn thing practically took the top of the building off. It was so loud. And then the crash sounded like a sonic boom. So I got up out of my chair and ran across the hall into my study and said to Rowan Williams, "Some cowboy's just gone through the sound barrier." And about that time, one of the other staff members at the other end of the hall began to scream because she could see the World Trade Center, and so we ran down there and saw what was going on. At the time, I was the director of Trinity Institute at Trinity Church, Wall Street, which was a kind of theological think tank. And my office was only a half a block from Ground Zero. So I was there that day, and it was the scariest day of my life. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was my guest at Trinity Church that day. He was going to do a video shoot called The Shape of a Holy Life, which is kind of ironic, because terrorists thought they were martyrs and leading the most supreme kind, or it was the most supreme kind of act that they were committing. Rowan arrived at Trinity Church in the lobby of our office building at 8:35 that morning. I took him up to my office on the 21st floor so he could have some quiet time before he went into makeup and for the shoot that was to begin at 9 o'clock. At 8:46, the first plane went in, and the sound of it was just unbelievable. I thought it went right over the top of my head and was going to take off the top of our building. And then the crash was not something that you heard, it was a percussion. So I ran across the hall into my study where Rowan was, and I said, "Some cowboy's just gone through the sound barrier." And he said, "Yeah, what was that?" And so began the beginning of the scariest day of our lives. We got up and looked out the window, and already there was a blizzard of debris flying past the window. And at the opposite end of the hall, some of my staff began to scream because their windows looked right out onto the World Trade Center. And we raced down the hall to see what had happened, stood in horror watching the black smoke pour out of the World Trade Center.
And I think, too, of the prayers and the words of love that people uttered on the planes as they went into the towers.
Right then and there, I knew it.
We were gathered for a church meeting about a block away from the Twin Towers. It's not quite hard to talk about, really. We were planning a seminar that morning in one of the buildings belonging to Trinity Church in New York, which is about a block away from the Twin Towers.
So we decided to go down to the television studio on the 4th floor, where we were scheduled to do this all-day taping on the shape of the holy life. And there's a sense in which there's a sort of peculiar kind of paradox about that title, because of course the people who drove the planes into the towers thought they were leading the most holy kind of life as martyrs. And as we sat on the set watching a television, the second plane went in, and suddenly we knew we were in a war zone. These security people told us to stay put because they did not really know what was going on outside and what might ensue, and so we sat on the set for the next 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden, our building began to shake. There was a huge roar, and as the building collapsed, though we didn't know what was happening, the floor upon floor, it sounded like an explosion, so we all thought that we were being bombed. And in the darkness, because the lights had gone out, all of us hit the floor. When the lights came back on, we were able to identify what had happened. The first tower had collapsed. I went over to our director of television, Bert Medley, and said, you know, we need to do something, and we agreed to ask Rowan Williams to pray. And so he then prayed with the group there in the studio in the sort of the height of this crisis, when people were really panicked. And he was brilliant, because not only did he in his prayer address the obvious tragedy, the suffering, the death that was just 100 yards away from us, but he also began to lift up the anxieties and fears of every person in the room and offer them to God in a way that just sort of brought tranquility and peace back to the room. And so we sat in the room because the security forces here told us to stay put and not to evacuate. We sat in the room watching the television monitor until the first tower came down. And the moment it started to come down, the television blacked out, so we no longer had any visual connection with what was happening down the block. And all we were left with were our own senses. And it began with this sort of dull, low, resonant roar, and that was punctuated by kaboom, kaboom, kaboom as it came down.
My bachelor's degree is in civil engineering, master's degree in engineering mechanics or applied physics, and PhDs in materials engineering science, which is an interdisciplinary course of study of applied physics, basically.
Mm-hmm. The official explanation, this pancaking where one floor broke free and it caused another one to break free, etc. You use the term baton passes. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Oh, baton passes.
You call it baton.
In our language. In a relay race, like a 1 mile run, each runner runs like a quarter of a mile, hands the baton to the next runner, who passes the baton and runs to the next one. So it's like a whole bunch of separate events that are connected. Mm-hmm. If you had a pancake effect going on, this floor is going to be breaking up, smacking on the next floor, which smacks on the next floor. It wasn't the whole building suddenly going at once. Mm-hmm. But if you have, it's kind of like a relay race. Mm-hmm. But what we saw, when the top floor hits the next one, it turned to dust. Mm-hmm. Well, there's not enough energy really from a gravity collapse to turn the building into dust, to turn the floor into dust, but let's assume there was. Mm-hmm. And then it doesn't have enough energy to break the next floor loose, but let's assume it did. Yeah. And so the next one has to start over. It's like it's the next runner for the next quarter mile.
Starting from zero
Right,
speed.
because it's another event beginning again. And how I thought of it that day on 9/11 was, if pretend let's over design the amount of damage to the building. Let's say 9 out of every 10 floors is missing, destroyed, and so the top floor can fall 10 floors before it hits the next one. And then mentally imagine every 10 floors you have somebody standing with a billiard ball in their hand as a timing device. I chose billiard balls because they're all like standard issue, but just a different color so you can separate one from the other. And this person can't let go of their billiard ball until they see the one above pass by. So the blue one is dropped, the person holding the red one sees the blue one go by or has an electric eye that releases it and lets that one go. And then the yellow ball 10 floors down gets let go when the red one goes by. And just going through that quick exercise, that's 31 seconds.
Right. So, and we saw, well, I think World Trade Center 2 came down in something like 8 seconds or something. Was it?
Yeah, it's hard to say how long it took to come down.
Right.
But what I looked at also was the seismic signal for the North Tower.
Yeah.
The ground shook for 8 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll come on to
Yeah.
that. You've compared the seismic signal or trace of the World Trade Center collapses with the Seattle King Dome in your book, and basically there was a 2.3 Richter scale magnitude for one of the towers, and it lasted 8 seconds. Just explain why that data is implausible for either types of collapse.
Well, with the Seattle King Dome, it was about 230, I think, feet from the ground, from roof to ground, and that took, maybe the ground shook for 52 seconds.
Right.
And the dominant period, it lasted about 9 seconds. If for a free fall, like from one of the towers, if you dropped a bowling ball off the roof, it would take 9.2 seconds to hit the pavement below.
Yeah.
If you dropped a bowling ball off the roof of the Seattle King Dome, it would take 3.9, or a little less than 4 seconds, for it to hit the pavement. Yet the major rumbling period for that building was 9 seconds, like twice as long.
Right.
Not half as long.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And the actual for the
or less.
The Seattle King Dome was. What was the entire seismic signature? It went on for longer than 30
like
seconds.
52 seconds.
52 seconds. And you also state in your book that because the amount of material in the towers was there was more material per square meter and higher, it would have had a bigger seismic.
Yeah, it was 30
footprint.
times. That's 3 times 10.
Yeah.
30 times more potential energy. More mass, and the center of that mass was higher up. So if you drop the building's weight from the centroid, which is the equivalent of where it goes from, it would be 30 times. But there's some other significant details of this that often get overlooked, which is the Seattle King Dome was a controlled demolition, yet it had an S wave and a P wave, the primary wave and the secondary wave recorded for that, which travel only through the earth. The towers did not have an S wave and a P wave. The signal did not go through the earth. It was only the surface waves that were recorded. Right.
Okay. And your field, the field that you're in, mechanical engineering.
Engineering mechanics.
Engineering mechanics.
Which is even more closely related to this.
You can calculate, if I give you any building, if I say, the post office tower in London, you could calculate if that was controlled demolition, approximately what the seismic footprint would be when it was brought down. You'd be able to do
but that's, in order to calculate the seismic imprint or the seismic effect from it, you're having to make assumptions. And I tried with this to not make assumptions, but to look, what I'm just looking at is what happened was not possible. It's way outside of what you would expect.
I mean, because we've got the different camps here, we've got the people who still believe the official story, which is that you know, that one floor came loose and knocked onto another floor. Now that would have taken a lot longer than a controlled demolition,
Right.
much longer, if it was true, okay? But even just comparing it with a controlled demolition, which is what a lot of 9/11 truth people think happened, you're saying that what would the duration of the actual collapse have been of one tower with a standard controlled demolition, in your estimate?
It would have taken, you know, maybe not as long as a, you know, floor by floor by floor event, but you have to get that material down to the ground. The biggest thing with comparing it with a controlled demolition is that how those occur is that you chop up the floors. You chop it up into sections and you drop those to the ground. They slam to the ground, they get broken up further. You don't have to break up every single floor. You're breaking it up in chunks. The chunks slam to the ground and get broken up further.
So what you're talking, obviously it would take longer than dropping a billiard ball from the top, which is
Exactly.
9.92 seconds or something.
Yeah, 9.2 seconds in a vacuum.
9.2 seconds in a vacuum. But what would your estimate be as to, let's say, how many seconds would the peak of the seismic trace be? I mean, would you be looking
Well,
at?
I can compare it with the Kingdom because there's
Right.
so much data with that.
Right.
But you've seen with other controlled demolition buildings, you hear a bang, 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 and then the tower starts moving down.
Okay.
So there's all these blasts going off before the building even starts moving.
Right.
Because they have to cut the building up.
Right.
And the building gets chop, 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 and then it starts falling.
Right.
Once it starts falling, it can fall relatively quickly if the stuff below it has been moved out of the way. So it pretty much has to be all kind of chopped up
So
together.
say if the Kingdom was like 50 seconds or something.
Right.
So the Twin Towers, you'd be talking longer than that.
Oh, much longer than that. If you use that as a
Right.
judgment, you need some, and also there's some other towers in Texas. Yeah, it would be many times what the free fall time
Right.
would be.
So it would probably be over a minute of seismic activity.
At least.
At least.
Because
And
the Kingdom's free fall
Right.
drop time is like 4 seconds,
Right.
and it was 52 seconds. You had this,
Okay.
you know,
Right. So,
on for.
and the seismic trace was 8 seconds in
For the North
duration
Tower.
in total. So that's proof that it cannot have been a controlled demolition or indeed the pancake theory.
I went over to our director of television, Bert Medley, and said, you know, we need to do something, and we agreed to ask Rowan Williams to pray. And so he then prayed with the group there in the studio in the sort of the height of this crisis when people were really panicked. And he was brilliant, because not only did he in his prayer address the obvious tragedy, the suffering, the death that was just 100 yards away from us, but he also began to lift up the anxieties and fears of every person in the room and offer them to God in a way that just sort of brought tranquility and peace back to the room.
People asked me to pray with them, but I remember feeling I don't know quite what to say, and the first thing I said was, let's not be afraid to tell God how afraid we are. And then, of course, thinking as we prayed about the people in the towers just a stone's throw away.
But the room began to fill with soot and smoke to the point where we could hardly breathe. And so we began to panic. We didn't know what to do. And the security people told us to go out into an exterior flight of stairs where there was no ventilation and less soot and smoke. But the fact of the matter was it had permeated the whole building. And at one point I thought we had maybe 15 minutes to live in that atmosphere.
We found some masks because there was smoke beginning to come into the building. And most of us strapped these on, made our way down to see if we could get out of the building.
Almost immediately, the whole room began to fill with soot and smoke, and breathing became very difficult. And our security people then told us not to evacuate the building, but to go into the back stairways of the building where there were no windows and no ventilation systems so that they thought the air would be cleaner. And we got back there, and it was only a matter of 10 or 15 minutes before the air in the back stairways became as suffocating as it was in the studio. And I can remember thinking to myself, hey man, maybe you've got 15 minutes left here. It's worse outside, and if it's this bad inside, God knows whether you can survive. And at that moment, Elizabeth Koenig, who is a colleague and a teacher, teaches theology at General Theological Seminary, who was among about 6 people standing on the landing with me and with Rowan Williams, came over to Rowan, and because she knows him well, she sort of put her hands on his shoulders and said, Rowan, there isn't anybody that I'd rather die with.
There was a creche of children in the basement, and we had to help get them out of the building at the same time, which concentrated the mind a bit, with 30-odd under 4s. Eventually we managed to get out through the basement of the building we were in, into this wasteland of devastation outside.
The cops broke in the back door of the building and screamed up at us to get the hell out of the building, and so we all sort of trundled down the 2 flights of stairs and out into what was nuclear winter. Everything was covered with 3 to 4 inches of this gray soot. It was like the surface of the moon, except that soot was punctuated by shoes and pocketbooks and clothing that were strewn all over the streets from people who had fled. The cars were all broken to pieces, and the windows were out, and it was like nuclear hell. I won't give you the details of how we managed to get out of that situation.
We ran with the children, carrying some of the children, down to the next square, the next open space, and dived into a porter cabin, which was full of people already. And there was a creche in the building on the ground floor. So as we got out, we had to bring with us a crowd of tiny children under 4 who were, as you can imagine, completely bewildered and terrified by it all. And that brought it home. It also stopped us worrying about ourselves.
My assistant, whose cousin was with us, another staff member, the cousin froze in her tracks and couldn't move. And Angelica, my assistant, went over to Rowan and asked for his help, and he went over and just embraced her and walked with her for the next half a block or so as she began to recover from her shock.
We ran with the children, carrying some of the children, down to the next square, the next open space, and dived into a porter cabin, which was full of people already. And
we made it down to the Staten Island Ferry building. We sought refuge in a construction trailer where there were a couple of construction workers, and as soon as about 40 of us went in there, there was a construction worker, obviously an evangelical Christian, who decided that he would take the lead and pray with us. So he got us all in this great huddle as we prayed together, and he went on and on and on. But little did he know he was praying with the next Archbishop of Canterbury, but he was. Half an hour transpired. Finally the air began to clear. I could see that the police were beginning to put people on buses, and so we left the trailer and went and got on one of the first buses.
And we ran with the children, carrying some of the children, down to the next square, the next open space, and dived into a porter cabin, which was full of people already. And one of the workmen there, didn't know who we were. He gathered us round together and said, I don't know about you guys, but I think this is a time when we ought to pray. And this workman led us in prayer. There was a creche of children in the basement, and we had to help get them out of the building at the same time, which concentrated the mind a bit, with 30-odd under fours.
When we got downstairs, the 22 colleagues, spiritual formation directors from around the country who'd been invited to join Rowan that day in dialogue on camera, were waiting for us in the studio. But it was close to 9 o'clock, and we thought we'd better go down to the television studio on the 11th floor. And when we got there, 21 of the spiritual directors we had brought in from around the country to sit with Rowan on the set and talk to him about the meditations he was going to give were already there. And panic broke out among the television staff.
And we ran with the children, carrying some of the children, down to the next square, the next open space, and dived into a porter cabin, which was full of people already. And one of the workmen there didn't know who we were. He gathered us round together and said, "I don't know about you guys, but I think this is a time when we ought to pray." And this workman led us in prayer. That few hours being on the edge of our own deaths, as we thought we might be, and being right in the neighbourhood of other people's deaths, and just being conscious of there being nothing to say except, "Lord, have mercy on us all."
Acting is a very emotionally vulnerable sport, and you have to get up and do it in front of an audience.
But basically tell a story with your body and your voice.
Part of our program is teaching actors skills to work on camera.
What force or guile goodness subdue through many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few for hireling traitors' wages. Such a parcel of robes in a nation.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
On March 19, 2003, George W. Bush and the United States military invaded the sovereign nation of Iraq, a nation that had never attacked the United States, a nation that had never threatened to attack the United States, a nation that had never murdered a single American citizen. والله جبنا طلعت عليهم بده ذاك اللي يضربني ما يرضى يضربني نقم معهم وهذا اللي بقى الحلفه جيب علي يعلق على الحلفه ترى النار يدبق في موته ما يموت
Now, about the Defense Department's war plan. It is not like that for the Gulf War. It's more along the lines of the Panama invasion of 1989. CBS News has been told it would start on what's called A-Day. A as in airstrikes. Airstrikes so devastating, they would leave Saddam's soldiers unable or unwilling to fight. The idea is to rain down the thunder so hard as to create, quote, shock and awe.
If the Pentagon sticks to its current war plan, one day in March, the Air Force and Navy will launch between 300 and 400 cruise missiles at targets in Iraq. More than were launched during the entire 40 days of the first Gulf War. The sheer size of this has never been seen before, never been contemplated before. Harlan Ullman is one of the authors of the shock and awe concept, which relies on large numbers of precision-guided weapons. so that you have this simultaneous effect, rather like the nuclear weapons at Hiroshima, not taking days or weeks, but in minutes. You also take the city down. By that I mean you get rid of their power, their water, and you begin this relentless campaign to wear them down so that 2, 3, 4, 5 days they are physically, emotionally, and psychologically exhausted.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth.
During the first wave of the bombing, the citizens of Baghdad suffered a version of the sensory deprivation described in the Kubark manual. In the chaos that followed the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the US did little to stop the looting. Some US officials even thought it gave them a head start on dismantling the Iraqi state. John Agresto, Director of Higher Education Reconstruction, said he saw the looting of schools as the opportunity for a clean start.
The care that goes into it, the humanity that goes into it.
شو رايك احد يضرب المدنيين يعني؟
مدنيين هي كلها هذا بيت عمنا كله مدنيين لكم عسكريين كله مدنيين يضربون من الله ينتقم منهم حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل 5 جنازات من جنازات بعد بيت يا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله الله انتقم منهم الله خذ حقنا منهم وينك الله وينك الله
Honestly, I think we should just trust our president in every decision that he makes, and we should just support that, you know, and be faithful in what happens.
Do you trust this president?
Yes, I do.
Good evening. The bodies of 6 soldiers killed in Afghanistan last week have been returned to Britain. They were flown into RAF Lynham in Wiltshire and then driven through the nearby town of Wootten Bassett, where thousands had gathered to pay their respects. Those who lost their lives included the 5 soldiers shot by an Afghan police officer. Our correspondent John Kay watched the repatriation ceremony.
They waited for hours in the rain. Fathers and brothers, girlfriends and mothers, widows and children, mates, and thousands of complete strangers.
These are young lads. They're just young lads.
Oh, it's terrible, terrible. You know, to see them come through, it breaks my heart.
Nicola was among the first to arrive. A former cadet, she's now seen 23 of her friends killed in action.
It's really heartbreaking, but knowing they do what they loved is, you know, a bit of a help, but just wish it could be a lot different.
Then, through the gloom, the sight they dread in Wootten Bassett. This time, 6 bodies. 5 of them killed by an Afghan policeman who was supposed to be on their side. Sergeant Major Darren Chant from the Grenadier Guards. His wife is pregnant with his 4th child. Sergeant Matthew Telford served with him. He was married with 2 young sons. At 18 years old, Guardsman James Major was the youngest of those killed. Corporal Nicholas Webster Smith served with the Royal Military Police. He was 24. Corporal Stephen Boot was a member of the Territorial Army. He'd volunteered to go to Afghanistan. And returning with them, the body of Sergeant Philip Scott from 3rd Battalion the Rifles, killed in a separate blast while clearing explosives. This was one of the biggest crowds Wootten Bassett has yet seen. In places they stood 20 deep. Each of the 6 families paying their own tribute. These the relatives of Jimmy Major, who would have been 19 on Thursday. His father laying a T-shirt on the hearse. The same rituals, but different names. And next week, more families will do this.
As he left here tonight, one local man said to me, it doesn't matter how many bodies come back at a time, or how many times you've seen this before, or what your politics are on the issue of British troops in Afghanistan. What happens here in Wootten Bassett remains uniquely moving.
Oh, there I saw the day that treason thus should sell us. My old grey was laid in clay with Bruce and loyal Wallace. But faith and power to my last hour, I make this declaration. Such a parcel of rose in a nation.